Can't sit down.
Good
now.
evening and a very warm welcome to all of you. I know that you share with those of us here at the museum, the archive especially, the pleasure and honor and privilege of having Pauline Kael with us. There really aren't sufficient words to thank her for this appearance, and the best thing I could think of that I thought would kind of tickle her would be for the archive to present her with one of the little treasures from our poster collection of classic films. And we thought it'd be particularly appropriate because it's a film which features Cary Grant. And if you'll read her new book, When the Lights Go Down, which will be available after the lecture, and she'll be able to autograph copies, you'll note that it begins with Cary Grant, and it's a film which was directed by the late Alfred Hitchcock. So, Pauline, we hope you'll enjoy the slightly worn but original poster of Notorious, and think of the key as also a key to the archive.
Oh, thank you very much. Oh, that's a beauty. Thanks, Edith. I'm not really sure what you want me to talk about. I do so much writing that I feel you probably, if you're terribly interested in movies, you may have read me on just about everything you're interested in. But perhaps there are some movies of the last year that I haven't had an opportunity to talk about, and I'll open things out in just a minute. And I'll talk about anything you want me to within discretion. That is to say, I will not discuss other critics. But apart from that, you can fire away. Let me say a couple of things, though, in starting. And I hope you won't think this is sort of opportunistic because this is Berkeley. But I was thinking about this past year in movies and the way the press has treated them. And I've been rather depressed to notice the strong class basis in the reactions to certain movies. That is to say, Kramer versus Kramer and Being There are such incredibly upper middle class movies. And I think Being There impresses a lot of people because of that, that golden glowing cinematography, which is indeed very beautiful, but also the slow pacing, which reminds them of George Stevens' movies of the 50s, and which is so different from the style of the more brutal directors of the late 60s and early 70s, and is so different from what the French New Wave brought in, and is so different from the style of Altman. It's so slow, it's so solemn, and you move in measured steps throughout that huge, incredible mansion. And finally, I got fascinated by the decor because there was so little going on in the movie. And you knew whatever you missed, Peter Sellers was going to repeat for you. And I was thinking about the style of Kramer versus Kramer. It's not just that it has a kind of professional class look, so that movie reviewers were complimenting it on its verisimilitude, meaning it resembled their lives. But also it has that incredibly austere, pure cinematography which reminds them of Bergman's Scenes from a Marriage, and hence has the smell of art. And I was also thinking about the fact that these two movies won't really lose a thing visually or conceptually when they're on television, because there is no particular background or detail. There's no... there's nothing speedy and fast to go on out of the corner of the eye. You get everything there from, one look at those frames, and you're never going to miss a thing on television, how perfectly prepared they are for their destiny. And yet Being There is being interpreted as a movie that makes a comment on television I'm not sure what the comment is, since Peter Sellers really seems more like a 19th century man than a man who has grown up watching television. I kept waiting for expostulatory phrases, advertising terms, the kind of excitement that kids sometimes show in front of the television set, and there was none of that. Nor was I sure what the message of the movie was beyond the simple statement that fools are sometimes taken for wise men by fools. But the solemnity has a great appeal, I think, to upper middle class and middle class audiences, maybe because it's reminiscent of the solemnity of foreign films, which they have been going to a great deal in recent years, in order to escape the speed and excitement of American movies. And the fact that American movies often deal with racial tensions, with fear, with subjects that suggest another class from the classes that used to be represented on the screen. The movie The Warriors got an incredibly poor press in this country, I think because it dealt in underclass attitudes. And I remember that when there were episodes of violence outside the theater, the newsmen on the evening news were condemning the film in terms that were reminiscent of the terms used for Blackboard Jungle when that came out, and The Wild One when that came out. But in that era, the press rushed in to defend those movies. Now the press didn't defend The Warriors. It's as if everybody wants to go back to the bland cheeriness of the World War II spirit and movies of the 30s. It's as if the whole country, the press included, had decided that we'd had enough of Vietnam and its aftermath and Watergate, and now was the time to revert to cheerfulness. And I think this is going to happen for a number of economic reasons, as well as for the fact that the public seems to show a great demand for it, as evidenced in pictures like Heaven Can Wait. But I think it's going to happen also because movies are now being financed by the advance sale to the networks. They are being financed by the advance sale to the networks here and to international television, and also the advance sale to theater chains all over the world. And the movies that you can sell the most easily to television and to theaters have established stars or people who are highly familiar from television. I mean, there's a reason why you're now seeing movies like Oh God with John Denver, and Hero at Large with John Ritter and Henry Winkler and a number of the women from series. It's because those movies constitute no financial risk to the movie company now. And if the movie has an easily paraphrasable theme, it can be sold to theaters all over. A picture like Breaking Away could not be sold in advance because it used people who were not great marquee names, and because it had no subject that could be easily explained. And the company was so unsure what to do with that they never really marketed it very well. And even despite the fact that people loved it, they still don't know how to market it, and now that it has gotten some attention, they've made the sale to television where it's going to be in a month. The movie companies now, if you propose any project that might have any kind of tension or excitement in it, they say, the president of the company may say to you, I don't know how to market it, and if I don't know how to market it, it's not going to make money and we won't touch it. But if it is an international caper or a heist or a silly sophomoric comedy, then it's a cinch because they can get all their money out in front. And the only thing that may constitute a risk for them is if there's a runaway production, if the people involved get all coked up and spend an extra $10 million, or if they get carried away with what they're doing and spend an extra $20 million. Then, of course, that is not guaranteed. But apart from that, there is less risk in movie making now from the studio point of view. than there ever was. It's only in the last 2 or 3 years that they have discovered this method and discovered how much they can pull out of television. And of course, everybody now understands that the largest audience is going to see the movie on television. And most people who finance movies now do not worry about the poor devil who plunks down his $4.50. What they worry about is what the networks will say. They don't want to have to make another soundtrack as they did on pictures like The Last Detail. They are simply going to avoid profanity, sex, anything that could conceivably upset the television audience. And I think this means an era of blandness and safety. I cannot tell you how many producers and directors in the past year have phoned me or contacted me and asked, can you recommend a writer who can write me a Frank Capra script? That is their new formula. And the terrible thing is that they're getting by with it. I had hoped when The Electric Horseman came out, it seemed such an obvious plastic movie, I had hoped that the young audience would reject it, that they would say there is no sexual chemistry here, there is nothing here, but an attempt to take over ecological themes in the dumbest possible way. But the movie's making money, and so, you know, there is no way to demonstrate that they're wrong in business terms. And from the point of view of the people who are running the studios now, since they are concerned primarily with money and power, there is no reason for them to make better movies or riskier movies. They're doing extraordinarily well. And so if you watch the Academy Awards, you have the spectacle of all these industry people who are prospering, giving each other awards and congratulating each other, when this has probably been the worst year of American movies in my lifetime. And that's a considerable span of years. And it's interesting to see that some of the best movies were totally overlooked. It is not merely say that The Black Stallion did not get the attention it deserved. I think it was by all odds the best American movie of the year. But that say Richard Pryor in Richard Pryor Live in Concert was totally overlooked, though I think his performance in that really transcended any of the male performances of the year. It went far beyond what any of them even considered doing. And Dustin Hoffman's rather sickly clean performance was honored, although the Academy ignored the work he had done a couple of years ago in Straight Time, where he played a mean ex-con and really showed some talent. But let's get back to Kramer versus Kramer for a minute, because an awful lot of people think that movies are dirty and pornographic. And movies are, at the moment, incredibly clean. There are, of course, the porno movies that play in a section of town and that are advertised in different sections of the paper. But almost no major studio now would finance a movie, say, that dealt with sexual tension at the level of Strindberg or Wedekind. And if you look at something like Kramer versus Kramer, you see this incredibly waspy view of a marriage. You see two people who get to court in a custody fight, and yet it's a movie without any sexual anger, without any pent-up rage, without anything that is projected onto the child. There is no pulling at the child the way they did in Strindberg plays like The Link. I mean, it is pre-Strindberg and Wedekind. These are clean, gentle, wonderful people who are considerate of each other. And there is no suggestion that those two people ever slept together. There is nothing that is a clue to where that child came from. Even the pure backgrounds, those wonderful Bergman-like walls, have that sterile upper middle class look. Anyway, I don't want to labor this about that movie. It's a perfectly competent movie. It's a well-done tearjerker. What I'm distressed by is that can be taken as movie art, and also that the press gets very excited about other kinds of movie art, such as Manhattan. I think that is perhaps the most middle class of Woody's films, except for Interiors. These are movies that are beginning to smell like art. I would say that Manhattan is an attempt to combine Ingmar Bergman and Charlie Chaplin, a rather unholy mixture. It is a film about the sterility of intellectuals, always a popular theme in the art houses. What it means to people in the Midwest or Europe, I cannot imagine. I have no idea why it's a hit. But movies that attack writers, sterile people who suggest that writers and intellectuals are cold and emotionless. You know, they are men who prefer a Porsche to letting their wives have babies. These sub-Bergman themes have great appeal at an art house level. And when you think back to what Woody Allen was doing a few years ago, do you remember that wonderful joke in Bananas when the two crucified Christs were fighting for a parking place? What a long way that seems from Woody Allen staring at a teenage girl who represents purity, faith, loyalty, who is really the new version of the blind girl at the end of City Lights. And what a strange notion it is that an adolescent girl represents purity. It is almost as old-fashioned an idea as the redemption by love at the end of American Gigolo. Right now, we're getting people who give us movies that look sophisticated, but that are saying very bland, simplistic things. And we're also getting a lot of movies which have a women's liberation message by simply reversing the sex roles. In Norma Ray, say, the husband, Beau Bridges, is playing the old June Allison part. He's there to take care of the children and wait for his wife who's out on the barricades. And although any woman worth her salt would probably say, what am I doing with this horrible masochist? How soon can I throw him out? We are supposed to see this as a wonderful arrangement. In The Seduction of Joe Tynan, the central character, played by Alan Alda, is a senator who's running for president. He is supposed to be a corrupt man because he's not at home with the kids, not at home listening to the kids. His wife is a psychotherapist. That's fine. But the man's profession and his interest in his profession is seen as a sign of selfishness and corruption. He's very like the stockbroker in An Unmarried Woman. I mean, it was a terrible thing that he was in that profession from the point of view of the movie. If he had been a doctor, we might have a different view of him. The men are always given professions now that we can look at with some disgust. The women have wonderful professions. They work in art galleries, they're psychotherapists, they find creative work at Mademoiselle magazine. But the husband works in an advertising agency. We know what that is. It's a terrible approach to liberation for women, to give them these weak men who are supposed to stay at home, and to remove the kind of rage and meaning that there would be in situations like that. I don't think movies have really got near the sexual revolution yet, and I think they're terrified of the kind of rage that many men feel and the kind of impotence which is becoming endemic on a lot of college campuses among men who are terrified because so much is expected of them. If you went to a college to speak about 10 years ago, during the question period, the men would get up and ask intelligent things, and the women would cower and hold close to their dates, and they would rarely ask a question. Now we have a reversal. The women ask marvelously intelligent questions. They seem absolutely free and independent. And the men seem sort of asexual, frightened, nervous, and rarely get up and say anything. Well, it would be very interesting to have the movies deal with some of this. And I think we should not settle for the kind of Ms. magazine editorial disguised as a character that we get in something like the Meryl Streep role in Kramer versus Kramer. I think there should be more awareness on the press's part. There should also be more awareness on the audience's part. I think people are much too accepting of movies now. I think they're so desperate to be entertained that they're willing to settle for too little. And if only there were a more active response, if people expressed their dissatisfaction more in writing articles, in writing to papers, I think there might be changes in some of this. There's an incredible passivity now in the movie audience, a willingness to accept that smile of the idiot, which movies had covering them in the 30s and 40s. And I think a willingness to accept repressive films, that is to say, movies which are bland by concealing all the tensions in the society. I mean, the essence of the Frank Capra movie was that it didn't really indicate anything of what was going on in the world. That even when it purported to deal with politics or economic problems, it was always in the context of a wonderful small town with beautiful white people and everybody clean and nice. And sometimes they were selfish, and that was bad, but they generally learned better at the end. There was no sense of the fact that there were conflicts which were insoluble, as, for example, there are in a marriage when both parents want custody. I mean, it is not that easy situation where the mother is so out of it and depressed and remote that of course you don't want her to have the child. She has no legitimate claim on the child. What makes drama is when two people have a claim, and what makes social drama is when many people have a claim, and those claims cannot be lightly resolved. I'm talking more than I wanted to. I wanted to get into a few other areas, but let me get into one other movie that I think was significantly mistreated this year by the public and by the press, and that is Cruising, which I think is a far more interesting movie than the public was told by the press. I think because it is a violent, difficult subject, the press made light of it. I saw reviews, I regret to say, in my own magazine and in the New York Times and other places, in which the reviewers wrote as if, what is this strange phenomenon? I have never heard of such a thing as men parading in black leather and chains. It was as if suddenly they were so distanced from everything that goes on in the cities around them. Now, I think the picture was brutally misshapen after the early demonstrations. The gay demonstrations, I think, frightened the movie makers off their theme because it departs from the novel and turns into a routine police thriller. And it avoids the subject it starts with, which is the self-hatred that many homosexuals feel that leads them to beat up overt homosexuals and leads them to mutilate homosexuals. It's the fear of one's own homosexuality. Well, the book is a very crude, poorly written book, but it deals with a legitimate, raw theme. And the movie starts out to deal with that, and it does have some raw power. But once again, it does not have that middle-class look. It does not have themes that the middle-class press people can deal with in terms that don't embarrass them. One of my strangest experiences as a critic, and I think it changed the way I write about movies, was when I reviewed Last Tango in Paris. The picture had been reviewed in quite contemptuous terms by most of the press. I saw it at the New York Film Festival. A magazine, of course, has a longer lead time than the newspapers had. The daily paper reviews came out the day after. Mine didn't come out till the following week. And the reviews poo-pooed the movie, treated it very lightly. Well, after my review, in which I tried to deal with how I felt about the movie and why it had been an upsetting, exciting experience, after that came out, a great many people re-reviewed the movie when it opened or wrote fresh articles, but they all dealt with the press furor or the reaction to my review. With the exception of Norman Mailer, no one I know in this country dealt with what the movie meant to him or how he felt about it. And I began to see, as I was attacked in the press for doing so, that was the way one needed to go in movies, that perhaps I had been dealing too superficially with movies, that maybe it was more important to deal with the emotions that they churned up in us and the ways that they affected us, sometimes on only semi-conscious levels. And I think sometime right around the period when I wrote that, I think my criticism began to change. It's in the middle of the book that's now called Deeper into Movies. And I think the last two books, Reeling and this new one, When the Lights Go Down, do have a much more personal approach. I am much less worried about the consensus opinion on a movie, much less worried about the surface content of a movie, and much more interested in getting at the sensations that upset an audience. The sensations, I mean, that they have. And I think, of course, that movies during the Vietnam years began to affect us on far more complicated levels. I think that's why even mass circulation magazines now often give space to movie critics and allow them to treat movies fairly analytically. But I've also realized that part of the excitement about movies is this complex of sensations, sometimes even contradictory ones. And I think that's perhaps why, from the start, educated people have preferred to think in terms of the theater as a cultivated medium, or have preferred to think of foreign films as the right medium for educated people, because, of course, foreign films don't affect us, generally speaking. They don't hit us at quite the rhythm that our own films do. They don't deal with our problems in quite the same way. And for the most part, it's easier for critics to praise foreign films for their sensitivity rather than dealing with the impact of American films. And I think my approach has made it possible for me to open up in certain reviews, open up areas that I was interested in writing about. I think I've gone further in this new collection in pieces such as the one on Get Out Your Handkerchiefs and Adele H., and on the discussion of Sam Peckinpah in it, and reviews of movies like Carrie and The Fury and the Warriors, a lot of American thrillers, trying to get at the ways that movies excite us and why they appeal to younger people often, and the older people are frightened of them. I mean, for example, I could not get my friends to go see Carrie. They were convinced from the advertising that it was a cheap exploitation picture, and although the picture did very well with a young audience, you simply could not persuade older people that it wasn't just an exploitation movie, that they would have a wonderful time. It has increasingly become difficult to persuade older people to go to see, I think, the best American movies. I wrote about that in an essay in this book called Fear of Movies. And I must say, although I've been getting very good reviews on the book, almost every critic who had a negative emphasis, it was because of that particular essay. They rejected the thesis because they feel I'm advocating violence, which is far from what I'm doing. What I'm suggesting is, well, we all know that that sex and violence were there in movies from the start. They're there right at the heart of all popular art. But I'm suggesting that educated people are afraid of the best American movies, of movies such as Taxi Driver and Mean Streets and the Godfather movies, and won't go to see them because they prefer the slightly repressive atmosphere of blandness and reassurance of safe movies, and that hence they are missing the greatest movie experiences of our time. Anyway, let me open this out to your questions before I spend too much time just talking. Yes?
Given what you just said during the last few minutes, I'm really curious now as to what your opinion is regarding all that jazz.
I think All That Jazz has, the Broadway flash. I think it's a pretty awful movie. And I was very dismayed at first when it was so honored in Hollywood, but I think I understand why. It's like a combination of I'm still wired, okay. It's like a combination of Fellini's 8.5 and a chorus line. The beginning is right out of a chorus line. People in show business love that view of themselves. I mean, most movie directors love the image of themselves as people at the center of everything. You know, everything depends on them. The women around all want to sleep with them, all need them. And sometimes, because they are sensitive artists, they have to give pain to these people. They have to reject certain people. There are no other characters in that movie. There really is no character. I think Roy Scheider is very good in it. I think it's a far more intense performance than I ever thought he was capable of. But it's almost a transparent one. You feel as if you're watching Bob Fosse. You forget you're watching Roy Scheider. And everything that takes place in that movie is his phantasmagoria. But it's so incredibly false. You know, I mean, well, just take a look at the real Bob Fosse. After he had a heart attack, he straightened out his habits, he's clean, he looks like a wimp now. He's not this Machiavellian, intense character. He takes care of his health very well. And my review of Lenny didn't kill him. It did not give him that fatal heart attack, which it does in the movie. I mean, he'll survive us all, okay? Let's put it this way. A man who has so little critical sense about his own work that he can choreograph perhaps the worst number of his career, that erotic dance which is like Lot and Sodom recreated, and then have his ex-wife say to him, that is the finest work, the greatest work you have ever done. He doesn't know that that number stops the movie cold. And the difference between Cabaret and all that jazz is Cabaret had a great script, wonderful cast, characters. It had what's needed to make a great movie musical. This one does not have those elements, and largely because it is all out of Bob Fosse. This is what has been happening to his recent work on the stage, too, in shows such as Pippin and in Chicago. In Chicago, he took a wonderful stage play and destroyed it with dull, banal language. In most of his shows on the stage now, there is barely anything to sustain your interest except the dancing, which is becoming very familiar Bob Fosse dancing. And that's what he does in All That Jazz. His editing in this is so bad that I think in the last 20 minutes, all you want him to do is kick off, because you're waiting and waiting and waiting for him to die. That last number is an atrocity. And look at the Jessica Lange role. Jessica Lange demonstrated in King Kong that she's a very competent, amusing actress. And here she is, Our Lady of the Oxygen Tent. She has nothing to do except be his vision of a Fellini image. And there is no one the scenes, the daughter has a quality, and I think Anne Reinking is marvelous to watch. She is just a great, sexy dancer. But here is a movie without characters, without a story. It is really, Tom Sawyer at his own funeral. And it is not enough. If it were a movie about the relations of sex and dance, which is, I think, a great subject, and one that would be an ideal subject for Bob Fosse, I think, given his abilities, it could have been great. But he needed a scriptwriter for that. He needed not someone to realize his fantasies at the script level, but someone to think out the subject. And that I don't think has been done here. Yes?
When are you going to make us all happy by starting back to the New York?
Well, thank you very much. I probably will in a few weeks. I can't quite get over last elements of reservation about it. I needed a break because I've been working there 12 years, of course only 6 months a year. The other 6 months I have to teach, lecture, do other work because, of course, I'm only on payroll 6 months a year. And after a while you begin to feel maybe you're getting in a rut. The movies, you've been saying, you don't want to start saying the same things. You don't want to start boring people. You don't want to dry up in the job. And there are not that many movies that provide you with a lot of stimulation. When the movies are bad, it is hell to write about them. It is unbelievable torture. I think when you're younger, it isn't quite so bad, because when you're younger, at least your point of view is fresh, and you have new things to say even on crummy movies. But when you've been doing it most of your life, you've said all you can say about mediocre movies, and you long for something original and new, and that comes a few times a year. And of course, if you're only employed 6 months, you miss half of those. I mean, if I'd had an opportunity to review Apocalypse Now or some of the other movies that open up in the other 6 months, I wouldn't have left. But as it was, I thought, well, maybe I should get out of my own head and the isolation that comes from sitting at your own desk working that hard. People don't realize what the life of a movie critic is on a magazine like The New Yorker. They think you lead an active social life. If, like me, you publish between 4,000 and 5,000 words a week, that's between my department and the notes on old movies up front, you dash into New York. I can't afford to live in the city. I live several hours out. I dash into New York for a couple of days, turn in my copy, go see a mess of movies, and dash back. And I'm by myself at a desk for the next few days. And, you know, you begin to think, well, maybe I need to be around other people and hear what other people think and see if there is some way of accounting for why so many people are praising this incredible schlock that's coming our way. And it was great fun. I signed a contract to work for 5 months in Hollywood. And I must say, I had a marvelous time because I could go out to the movies at night and then sit around with young writers and people who are working in the industry over supper and talk. And it's a great blessing for someone as gregarious as I to be able to talk when you've virtually been in isolation for 12 years. It's a very tough grind functioning as a movie critic, and largely because the movies are generally so bad. When you have something good, it writes itself, and the stimulation of it, you know, nothing is more fun than using your brain. And when you can use your brain on a good movie, it's just the most exciting thing there is. But suppose you have to confront, say, King of the Gypsies. What do you say about it? I mean, you know, you can point out that Annie Potts is charming, but beyond that, does anybody want to hear how bad everything else in it is? And how do you make a creditable piece of prose out of bad movies? If you have pride in writing, as I do, it becomes an incredible chore. It is my feeling that one should not trust the judgment of any critic who does not take the art form that he's writing about seriously enough to write a decent paragraph. I mean, I simply do not trust the observations of people who write sloppily or who write in illiterate hyperbole. I can only believe in the people whose level of observation and prose is, you know, does justice to the art of motion picture or to any other art he's writing about. Well, but in order to live up to that requirement, you kill yourself sometimes when the subject is a bummer. Anyway, that's why I have my reservations. Now I could finally have the job all year, but it comes a little late in life. And it's difficult also to know, given the conditions of New York, how long you can sustain that. It's a very, very tough grind. And there's also the specter of elderly writers who never come up with a fresh phrase and who are always applauded for work that is really a dull paraphrase of something they wrote 30 years before. I mean, you know, Perelman went on getting great book reviews every time he brought out a collection. But did anybody really develop an interest in Perelman from the pieces of his last 20 years? Wasn't it really a sentimental response to his earlier work? I'm not sure that people would get excited about V.S. Pritchett if they began reading him now. I think it's because they know of his glories of the past. It's a very treacherous thing when you write a great deal to age in the job. Janet Flanner's last 20 years were not great. And, I mean, you have to confront these biological processes and figure out if you should, quit when you're still doing well, or whether you should wait and rot in the job. And I still haven't quite resolved that. Yes, in back.
Yeah, so you mentioned that the Vietnam War had a great impact on both American movies and American movie audiences. I'm wondering what you think of the various Vietnam films that have come out. Which one do you think is the best, and how would you rank them, like Deer Hunter and Coming Home?
I don't think any of them really gets at the experience very well. I've written about both Deer Hunter and Coming Home. As a matter of fact, they're both essays, and they're fairly long. Both pieces are in this book. Deer Hunter was interesting because it's a sign of the times. It's the first really reactionary view we've had of the deer hunter, but it's kind of an inchoate, unresolved reactionary view. But, there's no accident about that God Bless America at the end. It is saying we are wonderful people, and those Vietnamese torture and get pleasure out of it. When we kill, we do it because we have to, but they kill for joy. And it is saying a lot of very racist things. On the other hand, it is not totally lined up that way. It also shows the Americans leaving behind people who worked for them. I mean, it's a very confused movie that I think is basically a Victorian movie that has nothing to do with the Vietnam War. It's a story of cowardice and courage, and it's like Four Feathers or Lives of a Bengal Lancer. The worst thing you can do in that movie is show that you're afraid, and the great thing is to show courage. It has almost nothing to say about modern warfare, and nothing really to say about the society we live in. I think in film terms, it's extraordinarily well done in places. The editing is superb in the prison camp sequences, and the opening, that wedding scene, although it's an obvious rip-off of the wedding in Godfather. I'm sure that's why they had to make it Russian Orthodox, to make it some way different from that. Still, it's great fun to watch that, and it's quite marvelous, and you almost get the feeling that you're really seeing something about American life. But really, you don't see a hell of a lot more than you do in a beer commercial when a bunch of guys are in a bar, drinking with their buddies. It's a very external view. It is also a Victorian movie in the way women have no real function in it. Even when the hero goes to bed with his girl, he sort of rolls over on top of her as if he had no idea what he's in bed for. There is no real suggestion of sex. It's about boys' comradeship. And I think it's a reflection of a kind of old-fashioned value that boys get into from reading boys' books. And somehow it stays with them. It's no accident that Cimino had worked with Eastwood before. It's part of that same way of thinking. In the case of Coming Home, it's the silliest kind of naive liberalism to give us a hawk who does not satisfy his wife and a paraplegic liberal who arouses her sexually. That is part of the oldest form of melodrama in which the man who held the mortgage on the farm was also out to rape the girl. And it is really time that people got beyond these notions that sex and politics go together, and go together so simply. I think it's quite possible that the macho aspects that often go with reactionary attitudes are very stimulating to women, and that hawks are probably, do rather well with them. Spanish males who have the most macho attitudes I know are said to be great lovers. And I think we ought to be able to, by now, to separate out all these melodramatic cliches. Now, when you take Apocalypse Now, which is perhaps the biggest example of American self-hatred ever to reach the screen, and the biggest example of American guilt. It's sort of a culmination of all the movies of the 60s and 70s, or the late 60s, that is. You have the same kind of naivete. I mean, the Vietnamese, my God, that girl was trying to save her puppy. And the Americans are all buffoons, clowns, freaks, or sort of stumble bums. I mean, the movie, is incoherent for many reasons and, practically from the start. But what's interesting is that same kind of naivete of attitude. The Vietnamese are always victims, and the Americans are always callous, indifferent, or stupid. And, it treats the war as if what was going on in the war was that Americans were metaphysically evil. We are demons.